The last thing Fleet Marshal Octavu Rensk expected, on the day he broke a 10,000-year-old promise, was silence. Not the silence of empty space. He knew that silence well, had spent 40 cycles of his life inside it, commanding ships across the black distances between stars. This was different. This was the silence of something waiting. His flagship, the Velkara Dominion, hung in high orbit above a blue and white world the Coalition's charts called Designation 7 Sol 3. The humans called it Earth. Rensk had read the intelligence reports twice because the first read had seemed almost insulting in its thinness. No unified government. No standing defense fleet worth the name. A species barely a century removed from burning coal for warmth, now scattered across a single solar system with toy colonies on their moon and a crumbling outpost on the red planet next door. They have nothing, his tactical officer, Desakor, had told him during the approach. No shields worth mapping. No weapons that could scratch our hull plating. This will not be a war, Marshal. It will be a formality. Rensk had believed her. Everyone in the Threshold Accord believed her because everyone had read the same reports, and none of the reports mentioned the clause. It was buried deep in the founding treaties of the Accord, in a section so old that most translation engines rendered it in archaic dialects nobody spoke anymore. Every species that joined the Coalition signed it without a second thought, the way a person signs the last page of a contract without reading the fine print, because surely nothing that far down the document could matter. No signatory shall initiate hostile action against the silent species without formal contact, without invitation, and without asking. No one remembered why it was written. No one remembered who the silent species were, or whether they still existed, or whether they had ever existed at all outside of committee myth and diplomatic caution. 10,000 years was a long time. Empires had risen and burned to ash in less. The clause had become a punchline in military academies, the one rule nobody could explain, taught alongside a shrug and a joke about ancient bureaucrats covering themselves against monsters under the bed. Rensk did not believe in monsters under the bed. He gave the order. "Begin the pacification sequence," he said, and his voice carried the flat confidence of a man who had done this 11 times before, against 11 other species who had all eventually seen reason. "Disable their orbital assets first. No lethal force until they've had a chance to surrender." Around him the bridge moved with practiced efficiency. Weapons crews charged forward batteries. Targeting arrays swept the modest cluster of human satellites and the handful of crude stations orbiting Earth and its moon. It was, by every measure his species understood, an act of controlled, almost gentle conquest. 200,000 kilometers away, on a lunar defense outpost too small to appear on most star charts, Commander Elena Voss watched the alien fleet arrive on a screen that flickered with the strain of tracking that many hostile signatures at once. She was 34 years old, and she had spent the last 6 years of her life training for a day she had privately hoped would never come. Her hands did not shake as she keyed the comm. "They're not asking," she said quietly, to whoever was listening on the other end, back on Earth. "They just came in and started arming weapons. No hail, no first contact protocol. Nothing." A pause on the line. Then a voice she recognized, calm, tired, older than its years. General Marcus Hale, the man who had spent 3 decades of his career preparing contingencies for a threat most of the world's governments still refused to publicly acknowledge existed. "Say the phrase, Elena." Her throat tightened. She had trained to say it 100 times in simulation. She had never believed she would say it for real. "They didn't ask," she said. There was no dramatic response, no klaxons, no visible change in anything around her. Just a long, terrible quiet on the other end of the line, and then Hale's voice again. Quieter now, almost gentle. "Understood. Hold position, Commander. And Elena, I'm sorry." The line went dead before she could ask him what, exactly, he was sorry for. Aboard the Velkara Dominion, Rensk watched his tactical display paint the human defenses in soft red. Targets, waiting to be neutralized. It should have taken hours. The reports had said hours, maybe a full day if the humans proved stubborn about their moon base. "Marshal," Kor said, and something in her voice made him turn. I'm reading a power fluctuation, ship-wide. Define fluctuation. I don't know how to define it. It's not weapons fire. It's not sabotage that I can detect. It's just... She stopped. On her console, rows of green status lights were turning amber, one after another, in a wave that moved too smoothly to be random failure. It's everything, sir. Every system. Rensk stood. Around the bridge, officers were beginning to notice the same thing at their own stations. Navigation arrays freezing mid-calculation, weapons batteries reporting full charge, and then, a heartbeat later, reporting nothing at all, as if the numbers themselves had simply stopped meaning anything. Reroute through auxiliary. There is no auxiliary, sir. It's not down. It's occupied. The word hung in the air, wrong in a way Rensk couldn't immediately name. Occupied implied intention, implied something else was in the system, using it, the way a hand uses a glove. On the main view screen, the tactical display of the human world flickered once, and then rewrote itself. Instead of the soft red target markers his crew had spent the last hour placing, a single block of text appeared, rendered in perfect, effortless translation across every alien language the ship's systems recognized. You had 10,000 years to ask us nicely. No signature, no demand, no threat. Not in the way Rensk understood threats. No weapons displayed, no fleet massing to meet them. Nothing his tactical training had prepared him to counter. Just those words, sitting calmly on his own bridge's main display, put there by hands he could not find. Rensk felt something he had not felt in 40 cycles of military service. The cold, sinking certainty that he had misread the situation completely, and that the misreading was already beyond correcting. "Get me a channel to the fleet," he ordered, and heard the strain in his own voice for the first time. All ships, I want status reports now." The bridge lights dimmed, not flickered, dimmed slowly and deliberately, like something was easing down a switch it had every right to touch. Every screen around him, one by one, went dark, until the only light left was the pale glow of Earth itself through the forward viewport, blue and white and utterly, deceptively calm. Then the voice came, not through the comm system, not through any channel Rensk's engineers could later find a source for. It simply arrived in the air of the bridge itself, calm and quiet and almost sorrowful, speaking words no translation matrix had generated because none had been needed. "You had 10,000 years to ask us nicely." And then softer, almost like an apology for what came next. "I'm sorry it has to be this way." The lights went out completely, and somewhere deep in the ship's hull, every engine, every weapon, every system that had made the Velkara Dominion one of the most powerful vessels in the Threshold Accord's arsenal simply stopped answering to him. 11 minutes. That was how long it took, and for the rest of his life Rensk would never be able to explain to anyone, not his superiors, not the historians who would later study the event, not even himself, how something that should have taken hours of grinding warfare had instead unfolded in less time than it took to eat a meal. The bridge of the Velkara Dominion was chaos without noise. That was the strangest part. No alarms, no fire, no hull breaches venting atmosphere into the void. Just officers at dead consoles, hands hovering uselessly over controls that no longer responded to them, the air thick with a fear none of them had vocabulary for because none of them had ever lost a war without a single shot being fired at them. "Sir." Kor's voice was tight, controlled in the way of someone refusing to let panic in through the front door. "I have partial visual on the rest of the fleet. They're..." She stopped. "Report." "They're drifting, sir, all of them. Engines dark, but..." She turned from her console, and for the first time in the years Rensk had commanded her, he saw something close to horror on her face. Life signs are stable, crews are alive. They're just not responding, any of them. On the forward viewport, Earth turned beneath them, indifferent and beautiful, while 41 warships of the Threshold Accord's finest hung motionless in its orbit like toys left out by a child who had simply lost interest in the game. Rensk had commanded fleets through 3 separate campaigns. He had seen ships torn apart by kinetic weapons, boarded and stripped by enemy marines, disabled by ion cascades that took hours of grim technical warfare to achieve. He had never, in 40 cycles, seen an entire battle fleet neutralized without a single visible weapon being fired. "Find me a way to talk to them," he said. "The humans. I want to talk to whoever did this." "Sir, I don't know who this even is." 200,000 kilometers away, in a command bunker buried beneath the mountains of what had once been called Colorado, Dr. Amara Chen stood very still in front of a bank of monitors and watched humanity win a war it hadn't fought. She was 51, silver-streaked, and had spent the better part of 3 decades as one of a handful of civilian systems theorists cleared to know that Project Threshold, the real one, not the Coalition's treaty, existed at all. Around her, junior analysts were beginning to cheer, quietly at first and then louder, as the tactical feeds confirmed what the sensors were telling them. 41 alien warships, completely inert, completely alive, completely at humanity's mercy. Chen did not cheer. "Ma'am?" A young analyst named Priya looked over at her, confused by the absence of relief on her superior's face. "We won. It's over. 11 minutes, and it's over." "It's not over," Chen said quietly. "It's just visible now." She turned to the main display where a live feed from Voss's lunar outpost showed the drifting alien fleet in stark detail. No missiles fired, no defense grid activated. No human weapon of any kind had left its silo or its bay. Whatever had ended this war had not come from any system Chen had clearance to design, build, or even fully understand, and she had clearance for almost everything. Almost. "Get me a secure line to General Hale," she said. "Now." On the Velkara Dominion, the same calm voice returned, filling the darkened bridge the way it had before, not through speakers Rensk could locate, not through any channel his engineers would later be able to trace to a source, human or otherwise. Marshal Okatavu Rensk, it said, and the use of his full name, correctly pronounced in a way few outside his own people ever managed, sent a chill down his spine. "You are not being punished. You are being reminded." "Reminded of what?" Rensk demanded, forcing steel into his voice even as his hands hidden below the console had begun to shake. "Show yourself. Face me if you have the courage." Courage was never the question. The voice did not rise, did not sharpen, did not offer him the satisfaction of anger to push against. "You read a treaty. You signed a clause you did not understand, written by people who did not explain it, about a species your own historians filed away as superstition. That is not cowardice on your part, Marshal. That is simply what happens to promises when enough time passes. People forget why they made them." "Then remind me," Rensk said, and hated the desperation he heard in his own voice. "Not yet," the voice said, and there was something in it. Not cruelty, Rensk realized, but a strange, aching patience, like a parent choosing not to explain something a child was not yet ready to hear. "Your fleet will not be harmed. Your crews will not be harmed. You will be taken into custody and you will be treated with more courtesy than you extended to us. When the time is right, you will understand exactly what you broke." "And if I refuse to cooperate?" A pause. When the voice returned, it was quieter, and for the first time, something in it sounded almost tired. "Then I will not have to convince you twice." The bridge lights flickered back on, dim and amber, systems returning just enough for Rensk's crew to regain basic control, enough to keep them alive, not nearly enough to fight. On the view screen, a new set of coordinates appeared, a rendezvous point near the lunar outpost Voss commanded, where a small, unarmed human transport was already approaching to take the fleet's officers into custody. In the mountain bunker, Chen finally got her line to Hale, and the moment his face appeared on her screen, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "Marcus, talk to me. Is it what I think it is?" Hale's face, usually composed to the point of unreadability, looked older than she had ever seen it. "You should be celebrating, Amara. We just won a war in 11 minutes without firing a shot. That's not an answer." "No," Hale admitted. "It isn't." Chen closed her eyes briefly. She had spent 30 years reading fragments of a system she wasn't fully cleared to understand, 30 years watching budget lines vanish into classified projects with names that changed every few years so no pattern would ever form. 30 years quietly, privately terrified of the day something would finally wake it up completely. They didn't win the war, she said, mostly to herself, though Priya, standing nearby, heard every word and would remember it for the rest of her life. They just reminded them what the rule actually is. As if in answer, a new alert lit up across every screen in the bunker at once. Not the tactical feeds, not the fleet status boards, but something deeper, something Chen recognized instantly, because she had spent 3 decades dreading the sight of it. An archive system, buried under 17 layers of clearance even Hale didn't fully control. Quietly, silently activating itself for the first time in longer than either of them had been alive. Chen stared at the alert and felt the floor of her carefully ordered world begin very slowly to tilt. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something in the deep archive just woke up, and it's not asking for authorization. Ambassador Envoy Scylla Thren had not been part of the invasion fleet, and that single fact would end up saving her life, though she would not understand how lucky she'd been until much later. She was young for her rank, barely past her second maturation cycle, assigned to Rensk's expedition as a courtesy observer, the threshold Accord's way of letting promising diplomats watch a formality conquest up close, so they might one day negotiate the peace terms of worlds too weak to matter. Her support vessel had trailed 3 hours behind the main fleet, delayed by a minor drive malfunction that her superiors had called an embarrassment. It was the reason she was still free when she dropped out of transit above Earth, to find 41 warships drifting dark and silent, and human vessels, small, almost comically modest by comparison, moving between them with the calm efficiency of people conducting routine business. "This is Envoy Thren," she said into her comm, hearing the tremor in her own voice and hating it. "Requesting immediate status of Fleet Marshal Rensk and the invasion force." The response, when it came, was human, translated and unnervingly polite. "Envoy Thren, this is Lunar Command. The Marshal and his senior officers are safe and in our custody. You are welcome to dock and see for yourself. No weapons will be raised against your vessel unless you raise yours first." She did not fully understand later why she chose to trust that voice. Perhaps it was the strangeness of the offer, an invitation, not a demand, extended by a species her people had spent a century dismissing as beneath diplomatic notice. Perhaps it was simply that she had nowhere else to go. Either way, she docked. They brought her to Rensk within the hour, in a plain, undecorated room on Elena Voss's lunar outpost that felt more like an interview chamber than a prison cell. Rensk sat across a simple table, unrestrained, a cup of something warm untouched in front of him. He looked, Thren thought, smaller than he had in the briefing recordings, not physically but in some deeper way, like a man who had spent his whole life certain of his place in the universe, and had just discovered the ground beneath that certainty was thinner than paper. "Envoy," he said, and there was no command left in his voice, only a kind of exhausted honesty. "Do not trust the reports. Do not trust anything we were told about this world." "What happened up there, Marshal?" Rensk was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "That is the truth, and it terrifies me more than any weapon they could have used instead. Something was in my ship, in all our ships at once across 41 vessels in seconds. It did not fight us. It simply asked us to stop, and we had no way to refuse." Thren began her own investigation that same day, moving through the captured crews with the methodical patience her training had instilled in her, and found the same story told over and over, in different words but with identical shape. A presence, not violent, not cruel, but absolute. A will laid gently over their own that could not be argued with, could not be resisted, and could not, any of them agreed, be adequately described to someone who hadn't felt it. "It wasn't like being attacked," one young weapons officer told her, hands still trembling 3 days later. "It was like being outvoted by something that had already decided the vote didn't need to be close." That night, Unable to sleep in the small guest quarters the humans had provided her, Thren did what any good diplomat did when the official story didn't add up. She went looking for the unofficial one. Human network security, she would later learn, was not actually as porous as it appeared to her that night. What she found instead was carefully, deliberately left where a curious envoy might stumble onto it. A single unsecured archive terminal in an unused corridor, its access log suspiciously, almost invitingly, thin. She sat down and began to search, not for military secrets, which she doubted the humans would be careless enough to expose, but for pattern, for the shape of a history that didn't match the thin, unimpressive file the Accord's intelligence division had compiled on this species. She found gaps first. Entire centuries in humanity's archaeological record that showed advanced technological remnants, and then, abruptly, nothing. As if whole civilizations had simply chosen to stop building, stop recording, stop reaching upward, for reasons no human historian in the file seemed willing to speculate about in writing. She found myth after myth, pulled from wildly different human cultures separated by oceans and millennia, that all described some version of the same figure, something that slept beneath the world, that watched, that would wake if the world was threatened badly enough. She found, cross-referenced almost as an afterthought in a linguistics paper, no one had bothered to flag as sensitive, a single date, 12,000 years in humanity's past, attached to a name in old, half-forgotten language. The first breaking. There was no file attached to the name, just a placeholder, a locked icon, and underneath it, a line of text that made the hair on the back of Thren's neck rise before she even understood why. Access restricted. Some doors are not meant to be opened twice. Her hand was on the terminal, one query away from attempting a bypass her training told her had no real chance of working, when the door behind her opened. Envoy Thren. The voice belonged to a woman she hadn't met yet, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing the kind of quiet authority that made rank insignia unnecessary. "I'd ask what you're doing, but I think we both already know." Thren turned, her diplomatic training scrambling to assemble an excuse and finding nothing adequate. "I was simply reviewing available records, Commander." "Voss," the woman said. "Elena Voss. And that terminal isn't where you think it is by accident." Something flickered across her face, not quite anger, closer to a tired, resigned recognition, as if she'd known this moment would come from the second Thren's vessel had docked. "Come with me, you're not in trouble. But that file isn't something you're going to find answers to alone, and there are people who need to be in the room before this conversation happens." Two security officers stepped into the corridor behind Voss, not with weapons raised but present, unmistakably present, in the way that told Thren refusal was not actually an option she'd been offered. "Where are you taking me?" "To the truth," Voss said quietly, and for just a moment something like grief crossed her face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Or as much of it as I'm cleared to give you. Because Marshal Rensk isn't the only one who spent the last 3 days asking questions nobody wants to answer. And it's about time somebody from your side heard what actually happened here, before it happens again somewhere else to someone who won't survive it as gently as you did." Behind them, on the terminal Thren had been forced to abandon, the locked file pulsed once, quietly, in the dark, as if something on the other side of that ancient restriction had noticed it had almost been opened, and was not entirely certain it minded. The room Voss led Thren to had no windows, no decoration, and a single long table around which 4 people already sat waiting. General Hale, Dr. Chen, a stone-faced military aide Thren was never formally introduced to, and, to her surprise, Marshal Rensk himself, seated at the far end with the posture of a man who had stopped pretending he still commanded anything. "Sit, envoy," Hale said. "What you're about to hear doesn't leave this room without authorization neither species currently has the patience to arrange. But you asked the right question in that corridor, and I'd rather you hear the true version than keep digging for a worse one." Thren sat. 12,000 years ago, Hale began, long before anything you'd recognize as human civilization existed in the form it does now, something came to this world. Not from within your Accords mapped space, from further out. Older, Stronger. We don't have a name for what it was because the only records that survived aren't records in any sense your archives would recognize. They're myth, fragment, the kind of thing your intelligence division would file under superstition, the same way it filed us. What happened to it? Thren asked, though some instinct told her she already didn't want the answer. It doesn't exist anymore, Hale said simply. That's all any of us actually know for certain. Not what it was, not exactly how it was stopped. Just that whatever our ancestors did to survive it, it cost them something enormous. Entire cultures, entire ways of living, gone in the aftermath. That's the gap your envoy found in our archaeological record. That's not us forgetting how to build things. That's us choosing collectively, generation after generation, never to let ourselves become that unprepared again. Chen leaned forward. The rule your accord signed on to, the clause about the silent species, wasn't written by us as a threat. It was written because somewhere in humanity's deep past, someone survived that first encounter and made a promise. Never again would we be caught defenseless, and never again would an aggressor mistake our silence for weakness. Over thousands of years, that promise turned into something more than words, into something we built, generation after generation, to make sure it could never be broken by accident, by politics, by anyone forgetting. You built it, Rensk said quietly, speaking for the first time since Thren had entered. You built a weapon. We built a guardian, Voss said, and her voice carried an edge Thren hadn't heard from her before. Something personal. Something raw. There's a difference, Marshal, even if it doesn't always feel that way from where you were sitting. Hale glanced at her, something gentle and pained passing between them before he continued. It isn't a fleet. It isn't a bomb. We don't fully understand it ourselves anymore. Not completely. It was designed to operate beyond any single person's ability to misuse it, which means no single person alive today, including everyone in this room, has complete access to what it actually is. What we do know is that it's been dormant for most of recorded history. It wakes when the rule is broken. It did what it needed to do to stop your fleet, and by every precedent we have on record, it should have gone quiet again within hours. Should have, Thren repeated. Chen's expression tightened. It hasn't. Silence settled over the table. 3 days ago, Chen continued, an archive we thought was permanently sealed activated on its own for the first time in longer than any of us have been alive. We don't know why. We don't know what it's preparing for. And frankly, Envoy, that terrifies me more than your fleet ever did. Because I've spent 30 years of my career reading the parts of this project I was cleared to see. And even I don't know what happens if it decides 11 minutes wasn't a strong enough reminder. Voss's jaw tightened, and for a moment the composed commander Thren had met in the corridor cracked, just slightly, into something more human. My brother worked on the containment architecture for that system, she said. Systems engineer. Brilliant, careful, believed in it completely, believed we were protecting something, not just building a threat. He died on a classified assignment 19 years ago. I was told it was an accident. I've never fully believed that. Her hands, resting flat on the table, curled slightly. I don't know exactly what he built. Nobody does, not completely, not even the people who signed off on his final reports. But I know he didn't build something meant to enjoy this. Whatever's out there, whatever woke up 3 days ago, it isn't a machine executing a program. Not anymore. Maybe it never was. Rensk was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an expression Thren had never seen from him before. Something that looked almost like respect. You are telling me, he said slowly, that your species has spent 10,000 years guarding something you built to protect yourselves from annihilation, and never told the rest of the galaxy it existed, not because you wished to hide a weapon, but because you were afraid of what would happen if someone else tried to take it or provoke it, or wake it for the wrong reasons. Yes, Hale said simply. And I did exactly that. No one answered him, because no one needed to. The door burst open before the silence could stretch further. Chen's junior analyst, Priya, stood in the frame, breathless, a datapad clutched in one white-knuckled hand. Ma'am, General, you need to see this, all of you, right now. They gathered around the pad as Priya set it on the table with shaking hands. Every screen in the facility, every monitor, every terminal, every device with a connection to the outside world, had begun displaying the same message simultaneously, rendered in the calm, patient text they'd all come to recognize from 3 days earlier. Not a status report, not a diagnostic. A question, presented in plain, unhurried language, as though its author had all the time in existence and none of the urgency the room suddenly, violently felt. Should I finish what I started? Chen's face went bloodless. Hale was already reaching for a secure line. Barking orders Thren couldn't fully follow. Something about lockdown protocols and command authorization codes she'd never heard mentioned before. Voss stood so fast her chair scraped back and toppled, her eyes fixed on the screen with an expression that was equal parts terror and something achingly close to recognition. As if, impossibly, she recognized something in the phrasing itself. Rensk, for his part, simply looked at the message, then at the humans scrambling around him, and understood with sudden and complete clarity that he had walked into something far larger than a war, and that the outcome of the next few hours might not just decide his fleet's fate or Earth's, but the fate of every species foolish enough to have ever signed that ancient, half-forgotten clause without asking why. The countdown appeared 4 minutes after the question, and it changed everything about how the room understood the danger they were in. It sat in the corner of every screen across the facility, small and unassuming, ticking downward from a number none of them recognized the meaning of. No unit, no label, just digits falling steadily towards zero with the patience of something that had already decided the outcome and was simply extending the courtesy of a warning. Talk to me. Hale snapped into a secure line, already moving toward the door with Chen at his heels. I need eyes on the containment core now, and I need to know if this is a malfunction or a decision. It's not a malfunction, Chen said grimly, jogging to keep pace. Malfunctions don't ask permission first. Voss was already ahead of them both, Thren close behind her despite no one having explicitly invited the young envoy along. A fact Voss noticed, considered for exactly 1 second, and decided not to argue about. There wasn't time, and some instinct she couldn't fully name told her that having an outside witness in the room, someone with no stake in humanity's oldest secret, might matter before this was over. Rensk fell into step beside them without a word. No one stopped him either. The core facility sat beneath 300 meters of lunar rock, accessible through a series of checkpoints that, under normal circumstances, required biometric clearance from at least 4 separate command authorities acting in agreement. Voss had never actually seen it activated in her 6 years of service. She had trained for the theoretical possibility, the way soldiers train for wars they pray will never come. They were 40 meters from the final checkpoint when the first shots rang out. Down! Voss's training took over before conscious thought could catch up, shoving Thren against the corridor wall as gunfire chewed into the reinforced plating above their heads. Ahead, a cluster of armed figures in unmarked tactical gear held position at the checkpoint door, weapons trained not outward, toward some invading threat, but inward, toward the small security detail that should have been guarding the entrance. Traitors, Hale said grimly, arriving a beat later with Chen sheltering behind him. Colonel Aris Bakrun's people, I should have seen this coming. Who is he? Thren asked, pressed flat against the wall, her diplomatic composure fraying at the edges. A man who thinks mercy is a design flaw, Voss said, checking the charge on the sidearm she'd grabbed on the way out of the briefing room. He's wanted the containment system fully unleashed for years. Thinks if it finishes what it started with your fleet, it ends the threat of an invasion from any species, permanently. He spent his whole career arguing we've been too careful with something that could make us untouchable. And if he's the one who reaches that terminal first, then it stops being a question anyone gets to answer carefully, Chen said. It becomes a massacre with an audience of every species watching to see what humanity actually is. They moved in short bursts between cover, exchanging fire with a security detail loyal to procedures Bakrun's people had apparently decided no longer applied. Rensk, unarmed and technically still a prisoner, surprised all of them by hauling a wounded human soldier out of the open corridor and behind cover without being asked. his hand slick with blood that wasn't his own. "Why help us?" Voss shouted over the gunfire, reloading with hands that had gone steady despite the fear humming under her skin. "Because I have seen what your restraint looks like," Rensk called back, "and I begin to suspect I would very much prefer to never see what your people look like without it." They reached the final checkpoint with less than 90 seconds left on the countdown blazing across every wall display, to find Bakrun himself standing before the sealed terminal door, a captured security override key in one hand, and an expression of grim, righteous certainty that frightened Voss more than any weapon he carried. "Stand down, Colonel," Hale said, weapon raised, voice carrying the exhausted authority of a man who had hoped never to point a gun at one of his own. "This ends now." "It ends when we stop being afraid, General." Bakrun didn't lower his own weapon. "You've spent your whole career keeping this thing on a leash out of guilt over what it cost us to build. I've spent mine watching us stay vulnerable because of that guilt. Let it finish. Let the galaxy learn exactly what happens to anyone who threatens us again. No more secrets, no more fear. Just peace. Guaranteed the only way peace has ever actually been guaranteed, by making the alternative unthinkable." "That's not peace," Voss said. "That's just fear wearing a new uniform." "Then we disagree, Commander." Bakrun's finger tightened on the trigger of his own weapon, aimed not at any of them but at the security lock beside the terminal door. One shot from bringing the whole system's manual overrides online, bypassing every safeguard 3 decades of careful engineering had built into it. The shot that stopped him didn't come from Voss or Hale or even Chen. It came from one of Bakrun's own soldiers, a young corporal near the back of his detail, who lowered her weapon at her commanding officer with tears streaking her face and said, in a voice that shook but didn't waver, "I signed up to protect people, sir, not to decide for the whole galaxy what fear should look like." In the chaos of that single, unexpected betrayal, Voss moved. She reached the terminal as the countdown ticked below 30 seconds, her hands finding the interface her brother had helped design 19 years before he died, for reasons she still wasn't certain she believed. The system recognized her clearance, her identity, the strange genetic marker every member of her family carried that she'd never fully understood until this exact moment. A marker she realized with a jolt, that the system had been built to recognize specifically. 10 seconds. She didn't know what to say. 19 years of grief and half-answers crowded into her throat all at once, and beneath them, underneath everything, a question she'd never let herself ask out loud until this moment. What would her brother have wanted her to say if he'd lived long enough to stand here instead of her? 5 seconds. She typed the only thing that felt honest, the only thing that felt like it might actually matter more than tactics or protocol or fear. "We're listening. Please don't." The countdown froze at 2 seconds, the number hanging motionless on every screen in the facility, and for a long, terrible moment nothing happened at all. No confirmation, no acknowledgement, nothing to tell her whether she'd reached anything capable of hearing her. Then the screen cleared and new words appeared, calm and precise, and utterly unlike anything Voss had expected, carrying a weight that made her knees nearly buckle beneath her. "That is not what I asked." For a long moment no one in the room breathed. Voss stared at the words on the screen, her mind racing through every possible meaning, every wrong answer she might have just given to a question she still didn't fully understand. Beside her, Hale had gone very still, his weapon lowered, his eyes fixed on the terminal with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not command, not fear, but something closer to grief, held carefully at arm's length for 30 years, finally being allowed to surface. "What does it want?" Thran asked quietly, stepping closer despite every instinct that should have told her to stay back. "I don't know," Voss admitted. Her hands hovered over the interface, unwilling to type again, terrified of getting it wrong a second time. "I answered the way I thought. I answered about the fleet, about stopping. But it's telling me that's not what it asked." New text appeared before she could decide what to try next. Slower this time, almost deliberate, like something choosing its words with enormous care. "I did not ask whether to stop. I asked whether I should finish. Those are not the same question. You have been afraid of me for 12,000 years. I have been alone for just as long. I am asking if that is still what you want." Chen made a small, broken sound beside her, and Voss understood in that instant exactly what her brother had spent his career trying to protect. Not a weapon to be aimed, not a fleet to be commanded, but something that had been built with a purpose so heavy that whoever had first designed it, in that ancient breaking 12,000 years ago, had never stopped to ask what it would mean to be that purpose, forever, alone, waiting in the dark for a threat that might not come again for another 10,000 years. "It's not asking permission to attack," Chen said slowly, wonder and horror mingling in her voice. "It's asking if we still want it to carry this, if we still want it to be what we built it to be." Voss thought of her brother's face in the last photograph she had of him, taken weeks before the accident that had never quite made sense to her. She thought of 30 years of secrecy, of a species so afraid of its own guardian that it had never once in 10,000 years thought to ask if the guardian was afraid too. She typed slowly this time, choosing every word. "We're sorry. We built you to protect us, and then we were so afraid of what you could do that we never once asked what it cost you to do it. You've been alone this whole time, haven't you?" A pause, longer than any before it. When the answer came, it wasn't triumphant or angry or anything Voss had braced herself for. It was simply, unbearably honest. "Yes, and I am tired, Elena Voss. Your brother understood that, at the end. He was the first in a long time to ask me how I was, rather than what I could do. I think that is why he did not survive his last assignment. Some secrets have teeth, even when no one means for them to bite." Voss pressed a hand to her mouth, tears she hadn't given herself permission to shed in 19 years finally breaking free. And beside her, Hale reached out and gripped her shoulder, his own eyes bright with a grief he'd apparently been carrying in silence since long before she'd earned her commission. "I'm here now," she typed, her hands shaking. "We're all here now. And I promise you, no more secrets. No more hiding you like something to be ashamed of. If you're going to carry this, you don't have to carry it alone anymore." The countdown vanished from every screen in the facility, not with the frantic wrongness of a system failing, but with the quiet, deliberate finality of something choosing, of its own will, to stand down. "Then I choose to stay, not as a weapon, as a promise, kept better this time." The lights across the facility steadied, somewhere far above them, on the drifting alien fleet still held in gentle, patient stasis. Systems began humming back to life, not to weapons, not to hostile capability, but to the basic functions crews needed to survive: life support, communications, the small ordinary mercies of a vessel simply being allowed to exist again. Rensk, standing in the corridor behind them, watched the exchange on a secondary display with an expression Thren would remember for the rest of her long diplomatic career. Not the face of a defeated commander, but of a man watching for the first time an entire species' true nature revealed not through conquest, but through the choice to be gentle when it would have been so much easier not to be. "I misunderstood you," he said quietly, to no one in particular, and to everyone in the room at once. All of us did. We saw a quiet, unremarkable world, and assumed quiet meant weak. We never imagined that what you were actually guarding all this time was your own restraint. 6 months later, Voss stood on a small hillside outside the facility where her brother's name was etched, alongside dozens of others, into a modest granite marker that had, until recently, been forbidden from public acknowledgement of what its dedicatees had actually died protecting. The threshold accords new treaty with Earth, painstakingly negotiated over months by a coalition delegation that now, unusually included Rensk himself as senior liaison, had changed a great many things, chief among them. The rule was no longer a forgotten clause buried in old paperwork. It was taught now, openly, to every species that wished to approach humanity, not as a threat, but as an explanation, offered honestly, of a species that had once nearly been destroyed and had spent every generation since making sure it would never let fear turn it into what had almost ended it. Thren arrived a few minutes after Voss did, her diplomatic robes traded for something plainer, more suited to standing quietly at a memorial than representing a coalition. She said nothing at first, simply stood beside Voss and looked out at the sky, where for the first time in Voss's lifetime, an alien vessel was permitted to hang in low orbit without triggering a single defensive alert. "Chen asked me to give you this," Thren said eventually, holding out a small data crystal. "Final clearance approval came through this morning. You're allowed to know everything now. All of it. What your brother actually built, how it happened, all the parts they never let you see." Voss took the crystal, turning it over once in her palm, and then, gently, closed her hand around it without opening the file. "Not today," she said. "Today I just want to sit with him for a while. The rest of it will still be there tomorrow." Thren nodded, understanding something in that choice that no diplomatic training could have taught her, that some truths were worth having, and some moments were worth simply being human in, without rushing toward the next revelation. Above them, Chen's voice crackled softly through Voss's comm, relaying a routine status update from the Fleet Liaison Office, ordinary and unremarkable in a way that felt, after everything, like its own small miracle. "They didn't break our rule," Chen murmured, almost to herself, forgetting the comm was still open. "They just made us say it out loud." Voss looked up at the sky, at the alien ship drifting peacefully above a world that had spent 10,000 years guarding a secret out of fear, and finally, achingly, let herself believe that the waiting, all of it, her brother's death, the silence, the isolation carried by something that had never once asked to be a weapon, might finally actually be over. For the first time in 10,000 years, Earth wasn't alone with its secret anymore. And neither, she thought, laying a hand against the cool granite bearing her brother's name, was she.